Any of you who have been tuning into this channel know that we have been doing a series on 2026. We are now officially into 2026, but there is so much to discuss about this year that we're continuing the 2026 prep series so that you can have all of the information that you need to navigate this year as best as you can. And there's always so much to gain from getting different perspectives from astrologers with different training, with different background, and different viewpoints on the world. So today we have a very, very special person. I absolutely adore Adam Elenbaas. So grateful to have him here on the podcast today, and also a part of our 2026 forecast panel that is happening on January 20th and 21st. Adam's going to be one of 7 astrologers, and we are going to be having panel discussions and deep dives into these aspects and the real highlights of 2026. So you have absolutely everything you need. So if you aren't registered for that yet, it's free. And all you have to do is go to astrologyhub.com/2026 forecast. These panel events are one of the most beloved events that we do because you get to see the interaction between the astrologers, which is really unique and special and very fruitful. So I hope to see you there. And today we are going to be doing a smattering of the biggest transits of the year as Adam sees them. So we're going to be covering the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, the Uranus-Pluto trine, the Jupiter-Pluto opposition, the nodal axis shift. Adam, did I miss anything?
No, that's good. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to just go ahead and dive in. And let's start with the first one that's happening in February. This is like I feel like this date, February 20th, is like tattooed on my soul at this point.
Mhm.
Seems
Yeah.
like a big one. So
Mhm.
let's talk about it. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I am in the process right now of building out the curriculum for my yearly masterclass series, which is on the decans this year. And so I've been doing the first class is obviously on Aries and the first decan of Aries, which is, I think, really an appropriate starting point for talking about this because from the perspective of the decans, which if you're not familiar, the decans are this way of mapping out segments of the zodiac through the signs 10 degrees at a time. And the way that I teach this, not unique, a lot of astrologers teach it this way, is that every sign kind of tells a story through the decans. The first 10 degrees of Aries tells the first part of the Aries story. The second 10 degrees tells the next part, and the final 10 degrees kind of brings the story to its conclusion, and then you move on to the next sign. The thing that's really unique about 0 Aries, 1 degree of Aries, right around the place where Saturn and Neptune are meeting, is that not only is this the first decan of the entire zodiac, but it's the first degree of the entire zodiac, first couple of degrees that these planets are moving across as they conjoin. And that first decan of Aries is related to the most primal, unhinged, instinctual release of creative energy. Fire is obviously the element of Aries, but this is the sign of Mars and the exaltation of the sun. These are yang energies. One way of thinking about yang from the standpoint of ancient Chinese philosophy, which I think corresponds really well to the masculine element of fire in ancient Western astrology, is that we're talking about centrifugal force. So a centrifugal force is one that it's congregated in the center and then it splits open, like it's very nuclear. And when it releases, it's like the atom being split. And so it has this destructive power that's creative at the same time. Like if you take a second to visualize even what physicists have said about the Big Bang, whether you believe in the Big Bang or not, just kind of as a image exercise, you think about this big bang that is the ultimate creative moment of the universe. And it's an incredibly violent moment. And the image of the first decan of Aries is an axe. So this alchemical imagery that was part of magical practices in the ancient world. And one of the images passed down through the alchemical magic tradition of the decans, well, an axe has incredible, it's a powerful invention when human beings came up with blades. Like when we figured that something sharp could split a coconut open or, split fire, and we could use the wood and so on and so forth. Like an axe is a very creative tool. I mean, nowadays it seems just kind of almost like we think of it as a weapon. but it's actually a tool. Originally, you can think about it like this is one of the first tools we ever came up with. And its creative potential, it can't really be separated from its destructive potential. And that's the first decan of Aries. The first 10 degrees of Aries, when planets transit through those degrees, are so powerfully creative, but they can't help but create as they split and separate things. Even the simple image, which, many different traditions around the planet have had of rituals connected to the separation of the child from the mother, different ways of cutting the umbilical cord with shells, like from the ocean, sharp shells that were used to cut the umbilical cord. That act is violent, but creatively necessary. The placenta, the cord has to be separated from the mother and the child. So creativity and destruction are almost inseparable in the 0 degree marker of Aries, that first decan of Aries. And so the first way of framing 2026 is a very powerfully creative year that will carry with it the precision and the cutting of new beginnings. I think about any powerful new beginning in my life that took to the ayahuasca path, early 20s. It cut me out of any path that would resemble normalcy for the rest of my life. And that was alienating and scary and super exciting all at once. I think the early part of Aries is like that. It has this very raw, untrained, undeveloped potential, and it's kind of destructive and creative all at once. Now, what I think is really interesting is when you pair that with Saturn, Neptune as the planets experiencing or triggering that kind of creative but potentially sort of violent new beginning, you get a very particular signature. Some of the things that stand out to me about Saturn, Neptune, for example, you have a planet that is the planet that demarcates limits and boundaries, notably between the realm of the mind of God and the visible cosmos that the gods ruled over. Saturn was the boundary keeper between those two realms in ancient cosmology and astrology. So Saturn, we commonly think of Saturn as limit structures and boundaries, but actually Saturn is more like the planet that demarcates the end or limit of something and the clear sense that there is also something on the other side. So for ancients, Saturn was a very mystical planet because it demarcated the boundary between the visible and the invisible. Well, Neptune in modern astrology, because it exists, beyond the boundary of Saturn, in many ways becomes a planet that represents a lot of what's on the other side of Saturn, the invisible, the intangible, all of which Saturn traditionally points to by contrast. Like when you get to winter, the Saturn-ruled time of year, you're aware of everything beyond the veil because the veil's thin during winter. It's dark, it's nocturnal, there's a sense of death in the air, and the veil is sort of thinner. The dream time is more open. The nocturnal space is more like lucid and apparent. But when Saturn gets together with Neptune, and by the way, Saturn, when Neptune was discovered, was in an exact conjunction with Saturn. It's almost as though Saturn or Neptune was pouring through the boundary that Saturn typically sets, So they have a history of being together. When Neptune was discovered, they were together. So what I want to say is that our awareness of things that are more mystical, transcendental, otherworldly, it doesn't mean that they're not here. That a lot of these realities are actually here, but it's our awareness of them that's not always there for us. So when these two planets get together, one of the things that can create this powerful sort of chaotic new beginning is the seeping through of things that we're suddenly aware of that we weren't aware of previously. And, our own limits of understanding, our own frailties, our own unconscious. When Neptune pours through the boundary of Saturn, now we're aware of some of those things. It's like a good therapy session. You go, holy cow, I just came to an understanding of something because a really good therapist gave me some perspective. Neptune's sort of like that in that it's like a good therapist seeping through the boundaries of your defense mechanisms. And then that awareness launches this very powerful new beginning. I would compare it to this, though, because of that first decan of Aries. When people have spiritual awakening experiences, or I'm in Al-Anon, a 12-step program, when people hit rock bottom and go to AA or they show up at Al-Anon or something, that initial phase is filled with excitement and enthusiasm, but it's also exactly the phase at which certain temptations come up. For example, when I first got into ayahuasca, my life was completely changed. It was a very powerful new beginning. I also was pretty zealous about it for a couple of years, before I really started embodying some of the things that I was learning. I was kind of evangelical about it. I thought, well, this will save the world, and I think a lot of us, that happens, where the excitement of a new beginning takes over so powerfully that we can become fanatical. We can become paradoxically rigid, even though everything that's opening represents a new kind of awareness or consciousness that's broader and bigger and wiser than the previous one. Still, fanaticism is an immediate risk of newness. It's like when you're in your 20s, there have been all these studies that have been done psychologically that show that a lot of the intense ideological lines that are happening collectively often come from young people. The reason for that is because of enthusiasm. It's youthful vigor. Well, Aries is that youthful vigor, and the young needs the old. The young needs the older, wiser veteran to say, good idea, you're going to take us in a new direction. I've got some sense of what kinds of containers are going to work so that we don't torch everything to the ground or become the revolutionary becomes the fanatic or whatever. So I think with this new beginning that comes through awareness of things that we couldn't see previously, there'll need to be really careful containers to hold this kind of fiery, passionate new start. So those are some of the things that come to my mind right away. The only other thing I'll say is the opposite thing can be true. Becoming aware of things that we weren't previously aware of is a very Saturn-Neptune dynamic. But another dynamic that can come up is disillusionment or disappointment. So where something new is exciting, Saturn-Neptune is associated with melancholy and with disillusionment. So Saturn can be very melancholic and especially in the sign of Aries, where it was traditionally in its fall, it can represent a pretty serious level of disappointment. Or, you're placing Saturn, a god of winter, in the first sign of spring. So they're awkward companions in a way where, for example, young things that are youthful and excited may experience something that almost takes away their joy. It's like a kid getting beat down by an alcoholic father. It's a very good Saturn and Aries image. Not that it's all like that. There's a lot of good things about Saturn and Aries too, but you can think of that youthful, exciting, innocent, naive, free-spiritedness of a child getting upended by a tyrannical adult. And so disappointment, disillusionment, things that try to get started because of vision or inspiration or imagination, but are rudely kind of interrupted or disappointed or blocked, and the need to persevere or endure for a beginning to get started despite something that's trying to block a very excited new beginning. And disillusionment too, where it's just I thought something was real or true. It's not. That can form a very powerful new beginning, but first you may have to process disappointment, frustration, and a bit of angst. So I think all of those things, when we look at them collectively and personally, that's probably the biggest transit of the year for all of these reasons.
It's just, it is so obvious why you have had a YouTube channel now for 9 years and almost daily content on that channel. Your ability to just flow the information through, it's so natural and beautiful. Recently, I was really decoding the word disillusionment, because I know even with the dance between 29 degrees and 0 degrees that we've been in over, in 2025, where Saturn and Neptune were doing this dance over these really important parts of the zodiac, that disillusionment could be part of the experience. So I wanted to know, what does disillusionment actually mean? Because it sounds really negative, right?
Yeah.
No one wants to be disillusioned, right? It's not something we all strive for.
Mm.
But when I looked at the way it breaks down, an illusion is a trick or a sleight of hand. And it's often associated with magic. I'm not talking about real magic. I'm not talking about the universe and the magic of this life. I'm talking about a trick, something that isn't actually true. And so
Yeah.
to be disillusioned means that you have this moment where you see through the trick and you
Hmm.
realize that it was not what it seemed like it was.
Yeah.
And so it's been helpful for me to think about that because I mean, I think if most of us are honest with ourselves, we don't want to be tricked. We don't want to be believing in something that isn't actually real or true. And yes, it can feel very disorienting and it can feel very challenging to go through the process of disillusionment. The end result of being able to see truth is probably something most of us ultimately want,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm wondering, in terms of when this might inevitably happen. So we have this epiphany, we have this new sense of awareness, we have this new sense of reality, and there's excitement and enthusiasm, and there's that youthful exuberance.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then reality hits. And
Hmm.
it's like, oh, shoot, like it's not what I thought, or it won't be as easy as I thought, or it's going to take
Hmm.
longer than I thought, or all those things. What would you say to a client maybe who's going through something like that? What is a guiding kind of principle or idea or even mantra that we could carry with us through that process?
Yeah. I think there's so many different, there's like varieties of disillusionment. I remember like a simple example that goes nicely with one of the versions you were just speaking to. When I first started, I've been hobby bodybuilding for 4 years now. And when I started that process, I had in my mind the idea that in 6 months to a year, I was going to look a particular way
Yeah.
with zero evidence. It was just what I imagined it would take and how long it might be. Well, I am I'm now 4 years in with regular consistent work and looking more like I thought I would 6 to 12 months in. So I kept going despite disillusionment in the beginning with what I thought the process was and required. And so sometimes disillusionment, especially in Aries 1, that decan, the whole journey of Aries, because one of the shadows of Aries is starting things but not being able to finish them or
Mm.
not being able to maintain, which is why we go into Taurus next that can hold and sustain things, right? So every sign has something that progresses or that another sign has that it doesn't. And so one way the disillusionment functions is not to say you can't get what you want, but to say it's going to require a lot more than your enthusiasm.
Ah.
This is why Saturn is in its fall in Aries, but has a very deep meaning there. Falls, all of the ancient dignity categories are nothing more than descriptions of difficult planetary contrasts. Mars and Saturn get together really well in Capricorn, they struggle in Aries. Because when you place Mars in Saturn's sign, it's exalted. When you take Saturn and put it in Mars' sign, it's in its fall. When Mars is adherent to Saturn in an Earth sign, it can climb a mountain. When you make Saturn adherent to Mars in a fire sign, it's like trying to enforce the discipline necessary for a bodybuilder in their first 6 months who thinks it's only going to take a year, you know? And so that disillusionment is a part of a process that's not meant to kill your dream, but teach you how to actually get there. And so it's exactly as you said, Saturn in Aries, especially, and we pair it with Neptune, and it just inflates the tendency to really overestimate something, how easy it will be, what it will require, what it won't require, what
Yeah.
sacrifices will be necessary. And just getting real about that, if you actually want to get where you're going, is like the greatest gift you could be given. One of my coaches said this, and I never forgot it. He said, so many people, if they had the education of what it took to get where they wanted with their goals in bodybuilding or health or nutrition, they'd get there so much more quickly. Half of the battle is getting accurate advice. That doesn't mean there's only one right way of doing things, but like getting a good coach, getting good nutrition advice, getting good training in a discipline like astrology or whatever. You find your teachers, that's like half the battle, is just figuring out what you actually have to do. So I think that's a great way of putting it. Disillusionment can be nothing more than actually finding the truth. And that truth is now you can actually go and do something because you've got the truth. And what better gift is there than that? But that requires that you care more about truth than initial disappointment, right?
Mm.
You have to jump, your ego has to like jump a hurdle where it's like, well, I know where I have to go. It's not as easy. That I feel a little tail between my legs about things, maybe, but like, is my desire to accomplish something, to do something heroic with my life, greater than my feeling of disappointment that it won't be exactly as I thought it was? Because if you get over that hurdle, then you're really on a path, and I think being on a path can see you through anything.
Mm.
That's Aries, right? It's a trailblazer, it's a pioneer. So I think there's a lot there. But the other side of disillusionment, which I think is the one that's a lot harder to counsel people with, because I find it pretty easy to be encouraging with people, especially when it comes to sticking with things, because that happens to be one of my own. I don't know, I've always been pretty good at that. Not necessarily being good at things, but sticking with things. Just like keep going, just keep doing it. And my Capricorn moon is like pretty good at that. But, always learning along the way, of course. Well, when people hit a moment of disillusionment where something that they thought was true or real gets pulled out from under them, there can be a very deep loss of faith. And that to me is definitely like the harder Saturn Neptune. When it's taking away, I don't know, it's just making things more real than you'd prefer they had to be. Like, I feel like encouragement in that moment, like getting up your hero's spirit to go do it anyway, is like easier than trying to recover faith when it's been deeply damaged.
Hey friends, thank you so much for being a part of this episode. Can you see why I absolutely adore Adam Elenbaas? He's amazing. And it's because of you and people like you that we get to have these great astrologers who come onto our platform. They love their experience engaging with our audience and our community. And so they come back again and again, and we get to have great content, and we get to grow the reach of astrology, getting into, quality astrology, getting into the hands of people all over the world. So thank you to those of you who have subscribed to the channel. Thank you if you've hit that notification bell so that you know whenever a new episode here is live. And if you haven't done that yet, now would be a great time. It takes a second, it doesn't cost anything, and it really supports the channel and also the astrologers that we feature on the channel. So thank you for being a part of our community. Now back to the episode.
When I was growing up, there was many, many scandals because I was a preacher's kid. So I grew up in the church, and there were many scandals that happened to preachers and their families because preachers hold this archetypal role in a community where it's like, hey, you're the spiritual leader. If you have an affair and it gets out, your family, everything's dragged publicly, and then people in the community lose faith because their leader fell down or whatever. And I watched my dad go through that, go through his own human shortcomings, which he's allowed to have, And I get that now that I'm an adult a lot more than I did as a kid because he was my dad and he was a spiritual leader. And I was part of a collective archetypal role in a Christian community. And seeing all of that crumble, man, I got into drugs. I completely lost myself because I was deeply disillusioned, disappointed, and sort of lost. I don't blame my dad for that now that I'm older. I see that it was a part of a much bigger arc in my life of discovering a broader, different kind of faith. And my faith evolved through all of that. So it's all good now. But initially, right, that happened while Saturn was in Aries in my 12th house when I was a kid. A lot of the crisis that we face right now in the West is we don't know what's true. We don't know who we can trust. And I think that's across the aisle politically, across the spectrum. There's a growing sense of conspiracy. And I think there's a very well-founded sense that there's more going on than meets the eye. We can't necessarily trust government agencies or leaders. There's secret islands where terrible things, like all of this. So, and all of that's real. And yet that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing to become conspiratorial and paranoid about everything. And yet it doesn't mean that there isn't some conspiratorial level of things that are happening. It's a very muddy place to exist when your faith is deeply disturbed. I think a lot about Buddhists. I've been studying a lot of Buddhist philosophy lately. I feel like I go through phases where I explore different world religions and faiths. And I'm a very deep reader. And so I've been listening to a lot of lectures by Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm sure you're familiar with, he's so sweet and so great. And I've been listening to a lot of lectures by Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talks about, that there's this transcendent level of peace that we can find in ourselves when we recognize that there's all of the opposites come together at the same time. faith and despair are two sides of the same coin. It's like, you know, he always does this example where he takes a piece of paper and he says, you hold this piece of paper, it's like there's an above and there's a below. You can't separate them. You can't tell the above to go more above and the below they're together. So one of the things that can help when Saturn and Neptune come together, or you have hard Neptune transits in general, is to remember that faith and uncertainty, faith and mystery, faith and doubt, despair and confidence, that they move in and out of each other like waves in life. And there are seasons, sometimes longer than others, where we feel like we're moving through shadows and fog and we can't see the path clearly. But during those times, if we can appreciate that this is the inner medicine of a different kind of understanding, faith, and wisdom being born, and I have nothing to do right now but be a midwife to it. I don't have to have certainty. I don't have to have faith. I can be disappointed. I can feel hurt. I can feel grief. I can feel lost. I can feel doubtful. I can feel a little paranoid, you know, but can I bear witness to it? Because it's the bearing witness to it from, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh's perspective that I appreciate so much, that we come to find peace with it as a part of the texture of faith. It's not separate from faith. It's part of how faith moves through different seasons in our lives. So to me, that's the kind of counsel I try to give, but mostly just listen when people are going through something like a Saturn-Neptune experience. And because it's the listening, it's the bearing witness to, if we model that as astrologers for a client, and then maybe gently encourage the same kind of thing. Do you have a listening practice? Do you have a therapist who can listen to you? Do you have friends that aren't going to tell you what to believe or just try to coach positivity into you when you're feeling deep doubt? Because when we just give it room to breathe and exist, then it starts planting seeds. And that's the potential of a disillusionment like this, is that, yeah, it may reveal things that are disappointing, or it may reveal things we thought were true that aren't, and there may be a deep sense of loss around that. But if you let that be a fertile place, then it has like serious creative power in our lives, and we just have to be patient with it.
This is one transit of the year. If this was the only transit of 2026, we have curriculum for a lifetime. You know, there's so much here. And I have an Aries South node. So I'm like very familiar with the Aries energy and that like childlike enthusiasm and the let's go and that spark, right? Also, the black and white kind of like, it's either true or untrue. It's either this or that. And then that moment of like, well, it's not true or untrue. It might be all of it. And that word that you used the word texture, the texture of faith. And it just made me recount the amount of times I've had to integrate that it isn't black and white. There are so many shades of gray in between. And so, and this kind of goes into what you were saying earlier about the, you know, becoming zealous and becoming, you know, I've found the answer and I want to tell everyone the answer. You know, all these ideas kind of go together and are inviting us into a deeper rootedness that is more rich and textured and has space for listening and really understanding and perceiving in new ways. So again, I'm like, God, if we just focused on this one transit happening on February 20th, but coloring the entire year, we would have enough content for a lifetime.
Yeah.
But there's more. And that's what makes 2026 so incredible. There is more. So let's go to what you also are really looking at, which is this Uranus Pluto trine. Why is this important? Why do you pull that out of all the astrological transits as something to pay attention to?
Well, I'm still working on, the closer the transits get, like the closer their archetypal season and like horizon line comes into my psyche, the more I have an understanding of how things might fit together. Like how does Saturn Neptune go along with these trines is something I feel like I'm still working on. We'll learn more about as it happens, more so than I'll ever understand it in advance. That's always true for astrologers. We hate to say it, but it's always true. I feel like my favorite kind of astrology is living it and learning as it's happening,
Yes.
But I think one thing that I would immediately offer as a juxtaposition is that Uranus in Gemini is like it's Hermes the magician, first of all. I would put it that way. I wonder, if our colleague Gary Caton would say something similar, because I know he's quite a hermetic philosopher, but like Uranus in Gemini, trining Pluto in Aquarius is so wildly inventive and futuristic and sort of sci-fi brilliant, and there's some shadows too, but like that's a trine. So there's a very flowing supportive aspect between planets that create revolution and powerful transformation and in very inventive, forward-thinking, intellectual, technological signs. So one thing that's like, let's just have fun for a second, because obviously there's a kind of psychological alchemy of Saturn Neptune. But if they're making us aware of things we haven't been previously in a year where these two technological wizards are meeting in a trine, the other thing that's really exciting is that this is the kind of year in which something like astrology or any other kind of, think of things like acupuncture, where it's just a totally different modality of healing and spiritual medicine technology, entheogens, stuff like that. Even our awareness of other species of life and aliens, put that out there. That's a big topic right now. These things have the power to become like these kinds of topics can accelerate so quickly in a year like this, because there's this opening through which to understand more. Neptune sort of seeping through Saturn. It's like, yeah, well, how about there's more of a collective sort of gestalt with respect to the insight of plant teachers. I think it's a very simple example. It wouldn't be necessarily flashy, but you may see some powerful headlines in the year ahead where MDMA therapy or LSD therapy or ayahuasca or any of these technologies, you're like, oh, whoever it was the other day, was it Prince William or whatever his name, or Harry, or one of the royalties was like doing mushroom therapy and talking about it on TV or something. And I was like, what is this? This is wild. Like I remember when I got into ayahuasca in like 2004, nobody was talking. I mean, pot was illegal. You had to like sneak around to smoke a joint. It was crazy. Nothing's like that anymore. This could be a year in which a lot of things that appeared not too long ago to be really like space tinfoil hat territory could actually become much more lucid in the collective dialogue. Like now we're talking about astrology in ways that are just way more open than people have been to them previously. So I feel like Saturn Neptune opens the door for a year of mystical and intellectual renaissance. That's my favorite part about the combination of these two, because Uranus in Gemini and Pluto in Aquarius are truly good transits for things like astrology, divination, quantum mechanics, like all that kind of realm is open wide up. Or if we're going to talk about more in the realm of the alien disclosure, this idea that humanity could become more collectively aware of the fact that actually we've had encounters with other species, even if it was just that, there's no more details than that, but it was just more broadly accepted that we've actually had contact with different forms of life or different kinds of technologies. That alone would be so paradigm shifting. So I'm excited for those kinds of possibilities with the two things side by side this year. But when it comes to just the trine between the two planets, sort of putting it in a vacuum, I'll just say something about AI for a second, because I think one of the things that's going to happen is this year is going to kick open several more doors in the AI development storyline. I think this year, along the lines of the trines, we're going to see more rapid development and advancement of the technology. We're going to see more people using it, more people becoming fluent in it. I mean, I remember in the late 90s when people were just becoming fluent in the internet. I see this year as probably a similar gateway year to some of those late 90s transits in Aquarius that we had, was Neptune, Uranus, that kind of thing. So probably more along those lines. But I want to say something about AI, because I had a good conversation with my colleague and your colleague, Patrick Watson. He's developing Nichepso, which is an astrology software that has an AI component built in. And he said this at NORWAC, which really stuck with me. He said, he was giving a talk, and then we were talking as well. And he said, AI is going to infiltrate the field of astrology from people who have no real interest in astrology, its ethics, its spiritual integrity, or its worldview. So we should be stewarding its use and development as much as we can consciously in transparent dialogue with each other as practitioners, as a field. That's what we're trying to do with Nichepso. And they're using forms of AI that I think are very ethical from everything I've understood, uses of AI that are ethical, and trying to have that conversation, trying to have honest conversations about the ecological impact, like all of these things. But like, if we don't have that conversation, AI is going to infiltrate the field of astrology, whether we like it or not. And I don't like that proposition. It makes me uncomfortable. But that's the kind of discomfort that Pluto Uranus bring up. I mean, people weren't comfortable when Pluto and Uranus got together in the late 60s with things that were advancing very rapidly and often wildly. Like, you have so many cultural forms of Renaissance happening in the arts and music and politics, and you have some really wild, uncontrolled things happening. It's like the Wild West. That's Pluto Uranus. So when that's happening technologically, do we have some reasons to be worried about the way the technology is going to develop this year? Sure, of course we do. But we also can't bury our heads in the sand when the internet wave part 2 is coming. You know, it's like we have to meet this as consciously as we can. And what worries me, and this is the thing I wanted to say, is I'm not so much worried about whether AI is good or bad inherently. My very limited understanding and interaction with AI to date, and I'm talking about like ChatGPT, that's about the extent of my understanding of it, is that we're really quick. I've noticed this conversation happening on social media in my spheres anyway. We're really quick to want to think of it as something that will save us or damn us. And what I'm more concerned about is how quickly we rush to label something and pretend to know or understand what something is without taking the time to actually get to know it. So I heard this quote from someone. I don't know if it's true, like a lot of things these days. I just heard it somewhere online. So I'm just being honest about that. Someone said that the amount of people that have very strong opinions about AI is wildly disproportionate to the amount of people who have actually had any meaningful time using it. And that's interesting to me, especially since one way of thinking about AI is that it's kind of like this weird mirror of ourselves. Right? It's like this weird mirror of collective human data and intelligence and consciousness. And immediately when we look into that mirror, if all we're trying to figure out before we've actually looked into it and spent time with it is whether it's God or the devil, that's an interesting immediate kind of feedback to be looking for in a mirror of ourselves. Do you see what I mean? So like, that's the level at which I feel most, I don't know, compelled, interested, curious, worried about the development of technology in the year ahead. Is like, it's going to happen rapidly, and it has the power to be, it's very Luciferic. Like the Lucifer archetype is like Prometheus. It's like a light bringer. Here's this technology, but it was stolen from the gods, but it gives you fire, which is so useful. The gods shouldn't have it to themselves. Yes, but if you transgress and take it, you'll be chained to the side of a cliff, you know, like it has this very archetypal sense of like, is this good? Is it transgressive? Like, what is this? But it's also ourselves. And so I feel like this year I'm going to try to stay curious as these trines hit, because I feel like there's some part of this that's, you know, we are the aliens. This is a mirror in some way too. So I'm going to try to stay conscious of that, as opposed to jumping to conclusions or rushing to say that it's the best thing ever or the worst thing ever.
It reminds me of the conversation we were having earlier about things being black or white. And
Yes.
it's like, it never is. It
No.
really isn't. And just as it's not true, you know, you're saying what's concerning you is how people that don't have a whole lot of, if this is even true, I got that caveat, people that don't have a ton of experience with it yet, just labeling it as good or bad, you know, evil or our savior. But don't we do that to each other? And don't we do that to ourselves? And isn't there a broad spectrum of truth? Aren't we sometimes this and sometimes that? And isn't there a lot more nuance? And what I'm getting here from you is seems to be a consistent theme now, is around this texturizing and nuance and not jumping to the extremes. That is a very Aries tendency to just go, you know, that fire is so necessary. That like big, huge initial spark is so necessary. There's nothing wrong with it. But recognizing that it is temporary and fleeting and that there needs to be something else. So around this AI conversation, I love what you came to at the end. Stay curious.
Yeah.
Before drawing conclusions. Rick Levine said something on a podcast episode we recently did. And I had this thought. So when he verbalized it, I was like, oh, that's so cool. What if AI, just like Uranus before it was discovered, or Neptune before it was discovered, or Pluto before it was discovered, were those planets there before we had awareness of
Right.
them?
Right.
Yes. Theoretically, they were there. They didn't just like materialize, right? They
Right.
were there, but we didn't have the tools, the technology, and the consciousness yet to perceive them.
Hmm.
What if AI is no different? What if it
Right.
is a web, an infrastructure of thought, like you're saying, this mirror that has always been there, and now we finally have the conduit to actually get into it? I don't know. Or
Yeah.
maybe it's the devil. I don't know. But
Yeah.
like you're saying, I think this staying curious, staying playful, not getting too attached to either or,
Hmm.
and no matter what, that stance will help you with the health of your nervous system.
Yes. Yeah. Just such a good Uranus and Gemini thing to keep in mind.
Exactly. And when our nervous system gets fried from all the stress and anxiety and trying to figure it out and trying to know, and that impacts every aspect of our life.
Yeah.
So, really just cultivating, and for a lot of us, I would say staying curious is pretty natural for me with my Gemini moon. But like I
Hmm.
know that that's not very natural for a lot of people.
Right.
So it's, maybe cultivating that aspect of ourselves to just be like, I don't need to know. I probably won't know right now. Probably no one knows right now. So even
Yeah.
if someone says they know, it's probably not true.
Yeah.
And how can I just stay open and perceive, and like you were talking about earlier, be that observer, and
Hmm.
what's actually happening here, and
Yeah.
yeah.
I
So
think there's such a strong tendency in us as Westerners. We inherit a very long-standing messianic and apocalyptic way of thinking.
oh,
There's a great book that was written by Nicholas Campion called The Great Year. I don't know if you've met him before. I haven't actually met him in person. He's an astrologer and he teaches astrology. There's a university program, I believe he's like the director of in astrology.
yes.
I think Jen Zart studied with him quite a bit.
And
Anyway,
Rick and Steve did an event with them last year, and I think Rick calls him the Dean of Astrology or something
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
that sounds like him. Yeah, he's brilliant. I've read all of his books, but he in that book he really outlines the parallel between astrology in the Western world, and we're talking about the ancient Hellenistic world, Mesopotamian world, even Zoroastrian, Persian, Indian, all of it has traces of this, but then it especially strong through the Christian West. It's this idea that is common actually throughout history in every single generation that we are living at the brink of apocalypse.
Mm.
And by that we mean that this great next leap in consciousness is about to happen, or a great salvation, or a great end of the world, or a great catastrophe, or whatever. And every generation lives through its own catastrophes. It lives through its own big leaps and developments in technology and consciousness and culture and politics. Like, oh, that's real and true. But it's not actually unique to humans to think this is it. And I feel like that book, without any kind of preaching, is just this gentle warning to disengage from that kind of thinking. Because though that way of thinking itself, he presents as archetypal.
Mm.
It's like there's an archetypal reason and necessity that we have as humans to try to understand the moment we're living in historically. Like and that moment, we're always living on the brink or the edge of human history. It's like a wave that's always cresting. So there is something real to feeling like we're in a moment of tremendous significance, but the weird truth is that every single moment that's ever existed has been like that because it's at the present, which is all there is. And I think something about a year like this, because air tends to be so dissociative, there's going to be a lot of historical narratives that I think are going to become much more appealing to us. We're going to feel much more invested in, that are going to feel much more like in our face. And I think that's natural. I don't think we should avoid it or bury our heads in the sand, but we can also remember that that cutting edge is every moment, that it's historic. It's every generation has always had moments where it's felt like that. And that if we remember that, we stay present to that, there's a natural way in the elemental cycle that ancients talked about that air is always condensing and falling like rain, you know? And so the danger of being in a moment of like historical emergency or urgency, whether it's a technological conversation or the Saturn Neptune conversation, is that we can leave our bodies. We can leave the earth. We can leave emotional intelligence, bodily awareness, as you were just saying. And what's great is that when we sit with air and that 20,000 foot historical Pluto and Aquarius perspective, and we let it come into our bodies, then the air turns to water and it falls down back to earth. And that's when we can really integrate the moments historically and feel them. Well, I'm just one person. You know, what does it mean to me right now? How do I feel about it? That level of intelligence can't be bypassed because we think we have to take accountability for having the right historical perspective for everyone of all time right now. That's so much weight, you know, so let the clouds fall. You know what I mean?
I do. And I was just thinking of that term that you hear thrown around a lot. Don't be on the wrong side of history.
Yeah.
Like, that's heavy.
It
That's like,
is.
oh my God,
Yeah.
this decision, the way I'm seeing it is literally right or wrong. I'm either on the
Mm.
right or the wrong side of history. And
This is it.
how am I going to face my children if I make the wrong
Yeah.
decision? I mean,
Yeah.
that is really part of the narrative you see all the time. So that is fascinating perspective. Really interesting. Okay. Let's go to Jupiter. We have Jupiter, Pluto, opposition, and nodal axis. And I know that we have a limited amount of time. So
Yeah. Yeah.
let's go into those two.
Well, I think that dovetails really nicely because the eclipses that are switching this year, February and August, we get solar eclipses in Aquarius and Leo. August, the nodes shift to Aquarius and Leo, North Node in Aquarius, South Node in Leo. And we also late July get the Jupiter. It's a very powerful full moon in Aquarius where we get the full moon in Aquarius opposite this Jupiter Sun cazimi, it's also opposite Pluto. It's like, whoa, it's a full moon conjoined Pluto opposite Sun Jupiter cazimi. I think that moment, late July, with the Jupiter Pluto opposition as just the densest part of that, speaks to the tension between the individual and the collective, the forces of history and the force of a personal heart that is not and can never be defined or contained by history. You know, like Heraclitus said, the soul is explored forever to a depth beyond report. History is what we can report. A depth beyond report goes beyond history, even soul history. So I always like to tell my students, like, when we're looking at birth charts, for example, hold it really lightly. Think of it more like when you were born, the gods gave you this image, and it's like a painting. And this painting is like an oracular, mantic wishing pool. And every time you look into it, at every moment that you ever look into it, at every different moment and stage of life, it's going to reflect back something different because you, just like the Buddhists say, like where can you actually locate a self? Your self is this contingent being that's in motion. So it's hard to like pin you down. Don't let a birth chart pin you down. Don't think I am my chart. Think I speak to the chart to understand something of myself, not all of myself. Because we want to retain a depth that goes beyond historical, objective fact collecting. And Hillman talks about this, Carl Jung talked about this, that soul history is something we recount specifically so that we can lose it again. You know, it's like you tell stories, and anytime you tell a story, if you notice, when we tell a great story with our friends and family, we're remembering it. Well, where was it? It came up out of, you know, some unconscious space. We're telling it, we're recounting it because it came back. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says, I am remembrance and forgetfulness. And they move, you know, like that. So I think this is a year where when you see these eclipses across the Aquarius Leo axis, where it's like there's going to be these forces that make you feel like, yes, I have to identify my worth, my value, my mission, my project, my creative path in the right historical and collective framework that validates me historically, collectively, socially. And then there's going to be this countervailing force that says, just forget about all of that. You know, just be a soul whose mystery is being explored to a depth beyond report, beyond historical accuracy, even your own historical accuracy. Be a mystery to yourself, be an enigma, and find your light in what is most obscure and hard to locate in who you are. That's the Pluto Leo axis, I think, really firing on all cylinders this year. It's like it's a year where, again, because of those other major forces we're talking about, where I think the pressure to want to define ourselves and our place within social historical narratives and frameworks will be very heavy and intense. And I think the countervailing force, again, is to push back by saying, I don't have to do that. It's not illegal to find myself in groups or communities or a part of things that are unfolding. But I also have to be something that is unique and beyond measure. And that has to be retained and maybe even fought for.
Amazing. I mean, so rich. I've never heard the Leo Aquarius axis described that way from that soul level perspective. And part of what I was hearing when you were speaking is to not take ourselves too seriously.
Yeah.
That to leave space for that mystery, to leave space to be surprised, to leave space for us to experience ourselves and each other in a totally new way, and to not just take it all so serious.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like
Yeah.
I find myself on YouTube a lot, like dealing with this as, a quote unquote public figure who has to like come up with postures, like when everyone in waves is starting to respond to something that's happening in the news or the media. Like,
Yeah.
well, what am I? There was a period where a couple of years where I was like, well, what do I do? Like, what do I say? What do I, and when I got really honest with myself, my deep inner answer was, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was a lot of just, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
This is overwhelming. That's painful. That's terrible. This is confusing. I don't know where I stand. I don't know what I can do. And so one of the most liberating things for me, at first I started saying, I'm not political, right? And then I started realizing, well, that's not exactly true, right? But what is true is that there's a lot of I don't know for me. And when I stayed close to that, I didn't have to say anything. I didn't have to posture anything. I just had to stay close to this humble, open, curious uncertainty about a lot of things. And the closer I stay to that, as things come up, as questions are brought to me, rather than trying to proactively get out and put myself in the right or wrong category or be with the good people or the not good people, all of that, the more I set that aside and just tried to stay very present, the less that I had to come up with any proactive posture for, for YouTube or whatever in my career. And I just feel like I have the North Node in Leo, South Node in Aquarius, and the South Node's right on my midheaven too. So yeah, I feel like that's been really a lot of the ways that I have of thinking about it have come from my past few years of navigating, being a YouTube person,
You know what's so interesting about that, Adam? And I'm sure you've already drawn this connection. Your past with your father. Because when you were speaking, I was like, what you just did by saying, I don't know, which is your deepest truth, is you took yourself down from the pedestal. You took yourself out of that position of like, I'm an authority who knows, and you should listen to me because you like my astrology, so probably all my viewpoints on all these other things are true too, which
Right.
puts you in a position to fall
Yeah.
because it's not true. It's not true
Yeah.
that you're all knowing. It's not true that any of us are all knowing, right?
Exactly.
So, but
Exactly.
what you did there, which is interesting, it's your South Node, to me, is I feel like you cleaned up that karma in a big way. You're not repeating that very natural human tendency to once be put on a pedestal to do everything you can to maintain that pedestal.
Yeah.
Right? And you just went, actually, you know what? I don't know. I don't know what, and I'm open and curious, and I'm still learning just like you.
Well, and it's funny because I'll leave with this last thought, but I speak with a Jungian therapist regularly, and it really helps me stay sane. The temptation for us that Jung talked about specifically is getting caught in archetypal identification. So, like, I play a role, astrologer, which is like an archetype that people recognize.
Yeah.
One of the things that I watched my dad have to figure out was his fall, if I want to even call it that. It feels kind of harsh to call it that. It's just his humanity came,
Yeah.
had to figure out how to separate itself from the archetype of the pastor, of the preacher. And what I've learned a lot about, and this is very Leo Aquarius, is that whenever we feel really socially resistant and rebellious against a role, it's often because we ourselves have gotten overly identified with a role that we were supposed to carry loosely, but got more fixed on than we maybe intended to or had any idea that we were getting. So then we have to create this revolution, this rebelliousness, very Aquarius. We have to separate and say, I'm not that. I'm an alternative person, or I'm a this, or I'm a that, and we go through that cycle enough. And I think what happens is we learn how to carry out those revolutions quietly. We say, oh, I'm getting identified with an archetype. I just have to loosen my grip. It's not that I have to introduce another archetype to get identified by contrast and create a polarization all over again. I just loosen my grip on an archetype that I was starting to get identified with. And then the revolution is more about just coming back to ourselves. That again is a mystery beyond report. That's not an archetype. We're a person, we're a soul, not an archetype. And then we can carry archetypes and wear them and play the roles and serve people with those roles without getting lost in them. And I see so much of that dance between Leo and Aquarius.
Oh my gosh. As my daughters are now 17 and 14, my years of identifying as mother, it's not that of course, I'll always be their mother,
Right.
but like that as being such a central part. They're already at the point, my 17-year-old's driving. She drives the 14-year-old. They don't need me as
Right.
much.
Right.
And so there's this moment of like, oh, whoa. When I was little, I envisioned my life kind of like all the way through having children, but I didn't spend much time like dreaming into what happens after that. Right.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's like all throughout our lives, we're going through these different, we're putting on different hats. We're putting on a mantle, and I've worn that mantle of mother, and you get so identified with it because it's
Mm.
so all consuming, right?
Yeah. Right.
But now that it's coming to an end, I'm like, whoa, okay,
Yeah.
loosening the grip on that archetype, and okay, what's next? And
Mm-hmm.
and not I'm gonna go totally identify with the next archetype, but in a way, it's kind of fun to play
Yeah.
with archetypes and to be like, okay,
Yes.
what's the next one? Like that's fun.
Yeah, because the archetypes are ways, as far as I understand, at least in the Jungian tradition, that they're ways psychologically of creating intimacy with ourselves. Like
Mm.
I've gotten to know myself through the role or costume of an astrologer in some amazing ways.
Yeah.
But the dad costume's like a totally different sphere. There's some overlap. It's like a Venn diagram or something. But
Yes.
like, and then we have to, but I think what's so hard about Aquarius, that like because we love to like really romanticize Aquarius, the age of
Yes.
Aquarius, and it's a lovely side. I love Aquarius. I got a bunch of Aquarians in my family. But one of the things that it's a Saturn ruled sign traditionally, and one of the things it can fall into, Saturn being the ruler of the opposition aspect, polarization, where again, it's like in order to get out of being overly identified as a pastor or a father, I have to go become a playboy and have an affair, right?
Uh,
And
uh,
my dad now, he ended up going to Pacifica and getting a PhD in Jungian psychology. He's a very bright guy.
wow.
And so he's really reflective about all of this now and in a totally different space. But he'll be the first to tell you, yeah, like that's the trap I got caught in midlife.
Mm,
So like these that dance between, and he is a sun in Aquarius, moon in Leo.
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys, there is so much here to hold. I hope that you'll re-listen to this episode because like there's so much to hold and so much to reflect on as we travel through this year and the astrology of this year. If you want more, you're going to get more at the 2026 forecast event. Adam will be there. So one of the things I love is when the astrologers have dialogue with each other and
Yeah.
really start to, kind of like bounce off each other and a
Hmm.
lot of things emerge that are very organic. And that's one of the things I love about doing live events is you kind of never know. We
Hmm.
create the structure, you guys show up, we have a great conversation, and the audience gets to be a part of that magic that happens.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
one,
go
I
ahead.
want to just appreciate Amanda just for a second to everyone watching, because I'm sure you already know this about Amanda because you all hang out with Astrology Hub regularly. But my observation, Amanda, is that you are just really, really skilled at creating containers for that dialogue, for that space of creative flow and collaboration. That's a real gift. That's a role that you inhabit very well. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I don't even know how to name that little archetypal role that I've been playing. Hostess, I guess. Yeah,
Yeah.
but no, it's fun for me because I think it's mainly about appreciating all of your gifts and creating a space where you know you're appreciated and that dialogue is encouraged and things
Mhm.
just happen. I don't have to
Love
do
it.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always love being here.
Thank you, Adam. And we always love having you. This has been such a pleasure. I mean, really, wow. I
Yeah.
have
Thanks for
pages of
having me.
notes, and I can imagine that our listeners and viewers do as well. So again, astrologyapp.com/2026 forecasts. Adam will be there. Rebecca Gordon, Adam Summer, Gary Caton, who we talked about a little bit here today.
Rebecca was my first teacher.
What?
Yeah, she was my very first teacher in 2010, just before I started my career, and she encouraged me to start my career. So I love Rebecca. She's wonderful.
She is so wonderful. I mean, we just had her on the podcast recently as well. Penny Thornton, Gemini Brett. So it's
Mhm.
like a real all-star cast. And we've had two behind backstage kind of dress rehearsals so far. And they are so awesome and they're so fired up and they're so looking forward to being with all of you. So hope to see you at that. And Adam, I adore you. Like I said in the beginning,
Oh,
I
thanks.
wish you all the best. You are doing an incredible service and you're so committed and dedicated. And just as you're talking about all these other books you're reading and becoming a bodybuilder and being a dad and all this, I'm like, wow, how do you
Oh,
hold all of it? Like that's very impressive and inspiring. So
no,
thank you for being
thanks.
you so
Yeah,
well.
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I can't wait to see you on January 20th and 21st at the Forecast Panel event. And I can't wait to see you on the next episode. Thank you for making astrology a part of your life, and we'll see you soon. Take care.